Have you ever found out your own parent stole your child's future to fund their favorite son's pyramid scheme? No. So imagine this. You are a bank manager. For years, you have carefully saved a $50,000 trust fund for your daughter's college signed by your parents as a sign of respect. Then one morning, the account is drained. You confront them at a large family dinner, and your mother looks you dead in the eye and says she is just a girl. Your brother needs this money to bring glory to our family. I did not scream or argue. As a bank manager, I know exactly how to track every digital footprint. I quietly compiled a thick folder, legally froze my parents' pension accounts for breach of trust, and sent one very important package to the IRS. Before I tell you what happened when the economic police showed up at my brother's grand opening, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Drop a comment below and tell me your age and what city you are listening from tonight. I am Sofia. I am 38 years old and I manage a retail bank branch in suburban Texas. My daily life runs on ledgers, risk assessments, and predictable margins. I prefer numbers to people because numbers rarely lie. For 16 years, my primary financial goal was funding the education account for my daughter Mia. I deposited $800 into that fund on the first day of every month without fail. The balance was $50,214.16. When I opened the account, I made a decision based on tradition rather than financial logic. My parents value hierarchy. To maintain peace and show deference to the family structure, I listed my father as a joint custodian on the paperwork. It was a symbolic gesture. He never contributed a single dollar, but his name sat on the documents, creating an illusion of traditional oversight. For a decade and a half, it remained nothing more than a signature in a physical file. Then came a Tuesday morning in late October. I sat at my desk drinking plain coffee before the branch opened, running a routine audit on my personal portfolio. I clicked the drop-down menu for Mia's college fund. The screen refreshed. The available balance read $0.00. The air in my office suddenly felt heavy and thick. The only sound was the dry plastic click of my mouse echoing off the glass walls. I unconsciously gripped the handle of my coffee mug so tightly my knuckles turned stark white against my skin. My eyes remained locked on the glowing monitor. When you work in banking, your first assumption is a routing error on the main server. But the knot tightening in my stomach told a different story. I pulled up a transaction history, expecting to see a pending maintenance hold. Instead, I saw a cleared wire transfer initiated at 4 p.m. the previous day. The funds were routed to a commercial account registered to a limited liability company based in Austin. I recognized the company name. It belonged to my younger brother, Julian. Julian is 32 years old and operates on the currency of unearned confidence. He was currently pitching a luxury tech startup to venture capitalists. He wore expensive cashmere and leased a European car, but he lacked actual liquid capital. My parents treated him like royalty. They viewed his ambition as a guaranteed lottery ticket. Looking at the glowing monitor, I realized my parents had not been hacked. My father had walked into a local branch, presented his identification as the joint custodian, and authorized the wire transfer of every cent I had saved for my daughter. This is where I made my fatal error. Protocol dictated that I instantly flag the transaction, freeze the destination account, and trigger an internal fraud investigation. If I had pressed that button, the money would have been locked in escrow within an hour. But I hesitated. I thought about my mother crying. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinners we would never share if I sent a fraud detective to my father's front door. Instead of acting like a branch manager, I acted like an obedient daughter. I picked up my phone and called Julian privately. He answered on the second ring, sounding entirely cheerful. When I demanded an explanation, he deployed his usual practice charm. He claimed it was a temporary bridge loan authorized by our father to secure a critical software developer. He promised his startup would receive seed funding by the end of the month, and he would wire the cash back with a 20% return before Mia even applied to university. I gave him 30 days. I told him if the funds were not returned by November 28th, I would escalate the issue. That 30-day grace period sealed my fate. Julian did not hold the funds in a domestic business account. He immediately dispersed the $50,000 into non-refundable offshore vendor deposits to build out his app interface. By the time I realized his promise was empty, the cash had crossed international borders. Standard banking recall protocols were now useless. The money was effectively vaporized. I had to drive home that evening and sit across the kitchen island from my 16-year-old daughter. I watched Mia's face shift from confusion to a hardened, cold anger as I explained that her tuition was gone. She did not yell at me. She just stood up, pushed her chair in, and said I chose their feelings over her future. She walked upstairs and closed her door. The heavy click of her lock echoing in the quiet hallway was the exact moment I stopped being an obedient daughter and realized I had to prepare for war. I did not skip the Sunday family dinner. In a family that operates on unspoken rules, absence is treated as an admission of guilt. I drove to my parents' house in the suburbs, parking my sedan behind my father's polished truck. Inside the house smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb. My mother was arranging silverware on the dining room table. She wore her pearls. My father sat in his recliner, watching a golf tournament on mute. The setting was a perfect replica of every weekend of my childhood. I sat down at my usual spot. I waited until my mother poured the water and my father carved the meat. Then I reached into my bag and placed a single sheet of paper next to the gravy boat. It was the printed wire transfer confirmation from the bank. I asked my father why he authorized the withdrawal. He did not look at me. He focused strictly on his plate, cutting a piece of lamb with surgical precision. He has always been a man who outsources conflict. It was my mother who answered. She did not raise her voice. She slowly picked up a piece of roasted lamb with her silver fork. The metal scraped against the fine china, producing a sharp, high-pitched screech that cut through the warm smell of rosemary. She chewed deliberately, swallowed, and looked directly into my eyes. She spoke with the calm, terrifying conviction of a woman who believes she is writing history. She said, "Julian is building a company that will secure our family legacy. He needs the capital now. Mia is just a girl, Sofia. She will get her tuition money when his application goes public." She called the theft an investment. She genuinely believed stripping her granddaughter's future to fund her son's gamble was a stroke of financial genius. There was no hesitation in her posture, just the cold calculation of worth. Julian was the heir. Mia and I were the funding sources. They saw no moral failure in reallocating resources to the child they favored. I did not flip the table. I did not cry or demand they write me a check. I folded the paper, put it back in my purse, and walked out the front door, leaving my plate untouched. The silence I left behind was heavier than any argument I could have started. The next morning, I sat in a leather chair across from a civil litigation attorney in downtown Houston. His name was Marcus, and he charged $400 an hour to deliver bad news. I handed him the account agreement, the transfer logs, and the offshore vendor receipts I had managed to pull before Julian locked me out. I expected Marcus to draft a criminal complaint for wire fraud. Instead, he slid the documents back across his mahogany desk. Marcus explained the brutal reality of the legal system. He told me that while my father's action was a clear breach of fiduciary duty, it was not a priority for local police. In the eyes of the law, it was a complex civil dispute over shared assets. Marcus looked me in the eye and said, "The truth is cold. We can sue your parents for theft and breach of trust, but it will take 5 years and $50,000 in legal fees. By the time a judge signs a verdict, Julian will have evaporated the money and declared bankruptcy. The law is designed to protect the ink on a contract faster than it protects the blood in a family. The legal system is not designed to punish bad fathers. It is designed to uphold contracts." My father signed the contract. I enabled the theft the moment I put his name on that dotted line 16 years ago to keep the peace. I left the law office with less hope and less money. I returned to my branch feeling the heavy weight of being outmaneuvered. If the law could not help me, I decided to use the tools I had at my disposal. I logged into my secure terminal and pulled up the interbank routing system. I wanted to see exactly where Julian's offshore vendors were located. I wanted to track the bleed and freeze his operational accounts from the inside. I typed in his business tax identification number. 20 minutes later, my desk phone rang. It was the regional compliance director. He did not call to offer his sympathies. He called to inform me that I had triggered an internal audit flag. I had accessed a commercial entity profile without a documented business need. He reminded me of the federal privacy regulations governing our industry. He told me that looking into my brother's accounts was a severe violation of banking protocol. My status as his sister offered no legal protection. If I ran one more unauthorized search, he would terminate my employment and report me to the State Banking Commission. I would lose my license. I would lose my pension. I hung up the phone and stared at my blank monitor. I was boxed in. I could not sue my family without bankrupting myself. I could not investigate my brother without destroying my career. Julian had successfully weaponized the very systems I respected against me. That evening, I found a heavy cream envelope in my mailbox. The return address was Austin. Inside was a glossy cardstock invitation for the official launch party of Julian's tech startup. The venue was a rooftop lounge that charged a $10,000 minimum for private events. The catering featured imported Wagyu beef and a premium open bar. I looked at the gold foil lettering. Mia was supposed to use that money to pay for dormitory housing and textbooks. Julian was using it to buy champagne for venture capitalists to maintain his illusion of wealth. I realized playing by their rules was a guaranteed loss. Traditional family loyalty requires silence. The legal system requires time. Corporate banking requires compliance. I was fighting a war on their terrain using weapons they controlled. So I stopped arguing. I blocked my mother's phone number. I blocked my father's phone number. I did not send a response to the launch party invitation. I cut the emotional cord that kept me tethered to their expectations. Instead of fighting a losing civil battle or risking my job, I shifted my focus to the one vulnerability Julian could not hide. He was reckless. A man who steals from his niece to throw a rooftop party does not hire a meticulous accountant. He cuts corners. I opened my personal laptop at my kitchen table and bypassed the banking network. I went straight to the state comptroller database. I began pulling public records, business franchise tax filings, and small business administration loan registries. I stopped looking at the money he stole. I started looking at the lies he told the federal government to get his company off the ground. I turned my dining room into a forensic accounting firm. For 3 days, I barely slept. The hardwood floor disappeared under a sea of printed ledgers and tax records. My eyes were bloodshot and my coffee went cold, but I could not stop. The clock was ticking down to Julian's grand launch party. I bypassed the dense banking networks and tore through public records, state tax reports, county debt filings. It was a chaotic blur of numbers, but when you manage risk for a living, you know exactly where the rats hide. Julian was arrogant. He left a trail. Buried under a pile of vendor receipts at 2 a.m, I finally found it, the smoking gun. Julian had applied for a massive commercial business loan through the Small Business Administration. That was his first fatal mistake. To secure a federal commercial loan, you have to demonstrate established cash flow. You cannot just pitch a software idea and ask for a government-backed check. You have to submit certified profit and loss statements. I downloaded the publicly available summary of his approved collateral. There it was, hiding in plain sight. I found an unexplained spike in his third-quarter operating revenue. He did not log the money my father wired as a family loan or a personal capital injection. He categorized me as stolen college fund as paid client revenue to artificially inflate his corporate valuation. He used my daughter's money to defraud the federal government. Public filings are enough to raise suspicion, but they are never enough to trigger a federal raid. To prove corporate fraud, I needed the corresponding internal ledger. I needed to show that the exact amount of $50,214.16 was used to secure the commercial loan. I could not get that information legally. The banking privacy firewall stood between me and the proof I required. I had spent 16 years building a spotless compliance record. I had fired tellers for looking at customer balances out of simple curiosity. I knew the regulatory rules. I also knew that playing by them would leave Julian victorious and my daughter bankrupt. I picked up my phone and called a man named David. David was an underwriter I trained a decade ago, who now worked in the commercial lending division of the bank holding Julian's primary accounts. I did not ask him for a favor. I leveraged our history. I told him I suspected my brother was running a shell game and using our family name to secure fraudulent debt. I asked David to cross-reference the deposit date of my father's wire transfer with the date of Julian's federal loan application. David hesitated. He knew the risk. If internal corporate security caught the inquiry, we would both face immediate termination. The silence on the line stretched for a full minute. Then I heard the sound of a keyboard clicking. David confirmed the dates matched perfectly. Julian had moved the stolen funds into his primary operating account, printed the inflated balance sheet for his loan officer, and then immediately wired the cash offshore to pay his app developers. It was textbook commingling of funds. It was a federal crime. I thanked David and hung up. I had my weapon. But a weapon always carries a heavy recoil. 2 days later, the regional compliance director walked into my branch unannounced. He did not sit in the guest chair. He stood by my door and handed me a printed log of my terminal history, alongside a flagged report from the commercial division. They caught the digital footprint. My unauthorized inquiry into Julian's offshore vendors had placed an automated watch on my employee identification number. When David accessed the commercial side, the system connected the two anomalies. I was escorted to the regional headquarters. I sat in a windowless room across from Human Resources and the Vice President of Retail Banking. They did not care about the family context. They cared strictly about corporate liability. I had violated the Federal Financial Privacy Act. Because of my long tenure, they offered me a brutal compromise instead of outright termination. I was stripped of my branch manager title. My access to the interbank routing system was permanently revoked. I was demoted to a back-office loan processor working in a cubicle farm 30 miles from my home. The promotion to district director I had spent 3 years earning was given to a junior colleague. I had to pack my office into a cardboard box while my former employees watched in silence. I paid for the truth with my career. I drove home with my box of plaques and framed certificates sitting on the passenger seat. I walked into the kitchen and found Mia doing her chemistry homework at the island. She looked at the box. I told her what happened. I told her I lost my branch, but I found the evidence we needed to stop her uncle. I waited for her to understand the sacrifice. I wanted her to see that I was finally fighting for her. Mia closed her textbook. Her face held no gratitude. She looked at me with the cold clarity of a teenager who sees the world exactly as it is. She said I did not lose my job for her. She said I lost my job because I was too weak to stop my father in the first place, and now I was just trying to fix my own mistake. She picked up her backpack and walked out the back door to sit on the patio alone. Her words hit me harder than the corporate demotion. She was right. The collateral damage was entirely my fault. I prioritized my parents' comfort over my daughter's security, and now we were both paying a price. The house felt massive and empty. I had no office, I had no title, I had a fractured relationship with my only child. The isolation was suffocating. I had nothing left to lose. I cleared the dining room table and laid out the physical evidence. I spent 3 sleepless nights compiling a sterile 40-page dossier. I did not include a single emotional word. I did not mention my mother's betrayal or my father's cowardice. The federal government does not care about broken families. They care about unpaid taxes and fraudulent debt. I structured the document like a corporate audit. Page 1 detailed the initial wire transfer. Page 5 tracked the offshore vendor deposits. Page 12 mapped the fraudulent commercial loan application. The crown jewel was the exact timeline proving Julian claimed stolen custodial funds as legitimate business revenue. I did not just send a file to the IRS. I knew the federal government moves slowly, so I targeted the one entity that reacts at the speed of light: risk. I sent the dossier to the fraud department of the commercial bank funding Julian's line of credit, and a digital copy to the Office of the Inspector General for the Small Business Administration. I knew that once a bank sees evidence of commingling funds and federal loan fraud, they do not wait for a trial. They trigger an immediate emergency freeze to protect their own capital. I was giving the bank the match and letting them burn Julian's world down to save themselves. I walked into the post office on a rainy Thursday morning and paid for certified delivery with signature confirmation. I did not call Julian to warn him. I did not send a dramatic text message to my parents. A threat gives the enemy time to prepare. Silence gives them time to grow arrogant. Julian was currently sending out daily updates about his rooftop launch party in Austin, bragging about his venture capital connections. He believed he was untouchable. He believed his sister was just a defeated bank teller. I drove home, drank a glass of cold water, and waited for the federal machinery to process the undeniable reality I had just handed them. I did not drive to Austin for the launch event. I stayed in my living room and watched it unfold through the digital lens of social media. Julian had hired a professional media team to live stream his victory. The broadcast showed a rooftop overlooking the skyline. Waitresses carried trays of imported oysters. Venture capitalists stood in small groups holding crystal glasses. Julian stood at a podium wearing a bespoke suit preparing to announce his Series A funding round. He looked like a man who had conquered the world using someone else's map. He tapped the microphone. He smiled. He began his speech by thanking our parents for their unwavering belief in his vision. He talked about legacy and innovation. He talked about the sacrifices required to build an empire. He never finished the sentence. The camera feed captured 4 people walking out of the elevator bank. They did not wear tactical gear. They wore expensive gray suits and carried leather briefcases. They were the lead investigators from the commercial bank's fraud division, accompanied by special agents from the Small Business Administration. Financial execution is a quiet process. The lead investigator approached the podium and handed Julian a thick manila folder containing a federal asset freeze order. Before Julian could even open his mouth, a low collective hum filled the room. Every single venture capitalist and investor checked their phone at the exact same second. They had all just received an automated fraud alert from the banking network. The live stream captured the silent panic spreading through the crowd. Investors exchanged cold, disgusted looks at Julian. They did not ask questions. They set down their champagne glasses and walked toward the exit, abandoning him on the stage. Only then did the live stream abruptly cut to black. I learned the rest of the details the following morning from a contact in the commercial lending sector. The agents executed simultaneous warrants at the rooftop lounge and Julian's leased office space. They seized his operational laptops, his servers, and his phone. When they served the federal freeze order on his primary business accounts, the venture capitalists in the room realized they were standing in the middle of a federal fraud investigation. Wealthy investors do not wait for explanations. They simply vanish. By midnight, every single letter of intent for seed funding was formally withdrawn. The startup collapsed before the catering staff even cleared the plates. There was no magical Hollywood resolution for my daughter. When the federal government seizes assets, they do not redistribute the recovered capital to the initial victims. They liquidate the holdings to satisfy the fraudulent commercial debt. The $50,000 my father stole from Mia was not sitting in an escrow account waiting to be returned. Julian had already burned it. He spent the capital on rooftop rental fees, public relations retainers, and offshore coding contractors who stopped working the second the wire transfers bounced. The money was vaporized. It became ash. I had to face the brutal reality of my own initial hesitation. Because I gave Julian that 30-day grace period, instead of immediately triggering a fraud alert, I allowed the theft to become permanent. I owned that failure. I had spent 16 years building a fortress of financial security, and I let my father walk through the front gate because I was afraid of an argument. The fallout did not stop with my brother. Federal audits are surgical and ruthless. When the investigators traced the fraudulent commercial loan application, they scrutinized every signature on the limited liability company charter. My parents had not just wired him the stolen cash. In their blind desperation to secure his success, they had legally anchored their own retirements to his sinking ship. They had pledged their state pension funds as secondary collateral for his early operational debts. They believed his lies so deeply they bet their own survival on his success. The federal government moved swiftly to collect. The commercial lender initiated foreclosure proceedings on my parents' suburban home. Their pension distributions were heavily penalized and garnished to offset the defaulted loans. The comfortable retirement they had spent 4 decades building was dismantled in less than 6 months. The pristine house with the rosemary bushes and the roasted lamb Sunday dinners was listed for short sale. My mother called me one final time before they moved into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. She did not call to apologize or ask how Mia was handling the loss of her tuition. She called to brand me a traitor. Her voice was thin and brittle over the phone line. She accused me of destroying her son out of petty jealousy. She said I was no longer recognized as a member of their household. She blamed me for the federal raid, the lost house, and the public humiliation. She refused to acknowledge that Julian built his house on stolen ground. I listened to her speech without interrupting. When she finally ran out of breath, I said goodbye and ended the call. I did not block her number this time. I simply deleted her contact file. She had nothing left to take from me. The ledger was finally closed. 3 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table on a quiet Friday evening. The house was still. I had a stack of paperwork spread across the wooden surface. They were federal student loan documents. I was filling out the application for a Parent Plus loan. The interest rate was predatory. The repayment terms would keep me working well past my planned retirement age. I signed my name at the bottom of the 16th page accepting the financial burden. I was a former bank manager taking on the worst kind of debt to fund a college education that should have been paid in cash. Mia walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. She saw the paperwork. She stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the bold print detailing the principal balance. She knew exactly what it meant. I was taking on a decade of debt to replace the funds I had failed to protect. Mia did not say a word. She just reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, stopping the rhythmic tapping of my pen. She picked up a highlighter and began marking the required fields on the loan application. For the first time in months, the air in the kitchen did not feel like a vacuum. It was not a celebration. It was a quiet recognition of a shared burden. We were no longer mother and daughter hiding secrets. We were two survivors building a new foundation on the ruins of a legacy that never deserved us. I did not win the money back. I lost my career trajectory. I lost my extended family. I lost the illusion of the parents I thought I had. But as I placed the signed loan documents into a fresh envelope, I felt a profound sense of clarity. I had successfully severed a toxic financial umbilical cord that had drained me for 2 decades. I chose to absorb the damage so my daughter would never have to be their collateral again. I accepted the heavy, lonely cost of ultimate peace. If this story resonated with you tonight, I want you to remember something important. Loyalty should never cost you your future. If you are the person holding your family together while they tear you apart, leave a comment below and tell me the moment you finally decided to walk away. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and check the description for another story about a sister-in-law, a stolen inheritance, and a safe deposit box that held the ultimate truth. I will see you in the next video.